The water in the old quarry had turned the color of rust and regret, its surface catching the late afternoon sun like a mirror someone had cracked and forgotten to fix. Jacob Mercer stood at the edge, boots sinking into clay that hadn't seen daylight in 40 years, watching his last hope circle the drain. The drought had been merciless that summer, turning his pastures to dust and his cattle operation into something that resembled a graveyard more than a ranch. 300 head of Angus, their ribs starting to show through black hides, and not enough water left in the stock tanks to last another week. The quarry had been his grandfather's mistake, a gamble on limestone that never paid off, filled with runoff and abandoned in 1952. Now it was Jacob's salvation, or it would be once they pumped it dry and lined it for cattle use. Assuming the bank didn't foreclose first. Assuming his daughter didn't sell the whole damn place out from under him the moment the paperwork cleared. Assuming anything in his life stopped falling apart long enough for him to catch his breath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The pump equipment arrived on a Tuesday, hauled in by contractors who looked at the quarry's steep walls and murky water with the kind of skepticism that costs extra. Miguel Reyes, the crew chief, was a compact man in his 50s with hands scarred from a lifetime of hard work and eyes that missed nothing. He walked the perimeter twice before speaking, his boots leaving prints in clay that had once been someone's fortune and was now just another problem to solve. "This is deeper than you said on the phone," he observed, not accusatory, just factual. "Going to take at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. And we'll need to shore up that eastern wall before we start. Looks unstable." Jacob had expected this, the way you expect bad news when your life has been nothing but for the past 18 months. Since the cancer took his wife Linda in March. Since his daughter Claire announced she was taking a job in Denver and wouldn't be coming back to help run the ranch. Since the beef prices dropped and the feed costs rose and the whole economic equation that had sustained 4 generations of Mercers suddenly stopped making sense. How much extra for the wall? Everything was about cost now, about calculating whether survival was financially feasible. Another 8,000, probably. Maybe 10 depending on what we find once we drain it. Jacob did the math in his head, adding it to numbers that were already impossible. The equity line was maxed. The operating loan was due in September. His savings account had exactly $2,300 in it, money he'd been setting aside for Claire's wedding before she'd called that off too, before everything good in his life had systematically dismantled itself. The ranch spread across 1,200 acres of Montana grassland, hemmed in by national forest on 2 sides and neighbors who'd been trying to buy him out for years. The Mercer name had been on this deed since 1891, when his great-great-grandfather had claimed it as homestead land and built the first cabin from logs he'd cut himself. That cabin was still standing, or mostly standing, weathered gray and listing slightly to the north, filled now with old equipment and memories that nobody wanted to sort through. The main house was newer, built in 1947 by Jacob's grandfather after he came back from the war with money saved and plans for expansion. It was a solid ranch house, 2 stories of timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that Linda had loved and that Jacob couldn't bring himself to sit on anymore because every board reminded him of her. Claire had grown up in that house, learning to ride before she could read properly, helping with calving season from the time she was 8, promising she'd never leave the way so many ranch kids did. But promises were like everything else, Jacob had learned. They eroded under pressure, washed away when the conditions got hard enough. Miguel's crew set up on Wednesday morning, industrial pumps and generators and miles of heavy hose that snaked from the quarry down to the drainage culvert that fed into Yellowstone Creek half a mile east. The noise was tremendous, diesel engines hammering against the silence that usually defined this place, scaring up birds and making the cattle restless in their pastures. Jacob watched from his truck, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, trying not to calculate how much fuel the generators were burning per hour. The water level dropped slowly, revealing limestone walls streaked with mineral deposits and the twisted remains of equipment that had been abandoned when his grandfather gave up on the quarry. By evening, the surface had dropped maybe 6 feet, exposing a ring of stone that looked almost deliberate in its uniformity, like something built rather than excavated. "You should see this," Miguel called from the edge, his voice carrying across the distance. "There's something down here that doesn't look right." Jacob walked over, his knees protesting, everything protesting these days. Miguel was pointing at something dark visible through the murky water about 15 feet down, a shape too regular to be natural, too large to be any of the old drilling equipment. "Could be a boulder," Miguel said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or could be something someone dumped. People used to use these old quarries as landfills, right?" "Sometimes." Jacob stared at the dark shape, trying to make sense of its dimensions. It was rectangular, maybe 10 feet long, definitely man-made. A shipping container maybe, or an old fuel tank someone had dumped illegally. But there was something about it that triggered a memory, something his grandfather had mentioned once over bourbon, late at night, when the old man's filters were down and the past came spilling out in fragments. "What if it's a vehicle?" Miguel asked. "We've pulled cars out of quarries before. Kids joyriding, drunk drivers, bodies nobody wanted found. It happens." Jacob didn't answer immediately. His mind was working backward through family history, through stories told and untold, through the gaps in his grandfather's timeline that nobody had ever quite explained. 1952 was when the quarry closed. 1952 was also when something else happened, something that had made national news for a few weeks before being buried under other headlines. A bank robbery in Billings, 3 guards killed, an armored car vanishing with over $2 million in gold certificates and bullion being transported from a mining company. The drought that year had been almost as bad as this one, his grandfather had said during that late-night conversation. People were desperate. Did desperate things. He'd been drunk enough to get philosophical but not drunk enough to get specific, which was how Thomas Mercer had operated his whole life. A man who kept his secrets close and his explanations vague, who'd somehow survived the Depression and come out the other side with money to build and expand while his neighbors went under. "Keep pumping," Jacob told Miguel. "I want to see what that is." By Thursday afternoon, the water was low enough that the shape had resolved itself into something unmistakable. It was a vehicle, dark green or maybe black under the sediment, sitting upright on the quarry floor like it had been parked there deliberately. The cab was mostly intact, the back was a reinforced box, and even covered in 40 years of silt and algae. Jacob recognized it from photographs he'd seen in history books and news archives. An armored car. Specifically, a Brinks truck from the early 50s, complete with the faded logo still visible on the driver's side door. Miguel stood beside him, both of them staring down at the impossible thing that had just become their responsibility. "That's what I think it is, right?" Miguel's voice was quiet. Jacob nodded. He was thinking about his grandfather, about the timing, about the way Thomas Mercer had always deflected questions about that year. About the quarry that closed suddenly despite initial optimism. About money that appeared when it shouldn't have. About a family legacy built on something that might not have been entirely legitimate. "We need to call someone," Miguel said. "Police. FBI maybe. This is evidence of something." Jacob understood that, understood the legal and moral obligation to report a crime scene, especially one involving 3 dead men and a fortune in stolen gold. But he also understood that the moment he made that call, this ranch would become something else. A media circus. An investigation site. A place where his family's history would be dissected by people with badges and authority and no understanding of what survival actually cost. And depending on what they found in that truck, depending on whether his grandfather's involvement could be proven, the Mercer name might become something he couldn't redeem. "Let's wait until it's fully drained," he heard himself say. "Make sure that's actually what we think it is. Once we're certain, we'll make the appropriate calls." Miguel looked at him for a long moment, understanding what Jacob was really saying. That they were buying time. That they were choosing to see completely before committing to a course of action. It was a small dishonesty, a temporary delay, but it was also the first step down a path Jacob recognized from his grandfather's stories. The path of compromises made under pressure, of survival prioritized over principle. "All right," Miguel said finally. But if there's bodies in there, if this is an actual crime scene, we can't sit on it long. The liability alone would destroy both of us. Jacob nodded, grateful for the reprieve, already regretting the choice even as he made it. By Friday evening, the quarry was empty, its limestone walls exposed for the first time in 4 decades, and the armored car sat in the center like an accusation. The back doors were still locked, the cab windows were intact, and there was no visible damage except for what time and water had done to the paint and chrome. Miguel's crew set up lights as the sun went down, industrial spots that turned the quarry into a theater where something terrible had been staged. Jacob climbed down the temporary ladder they'd erected, his boots finding purchase on stone that his grandfather had once believed would make his fortune. Up close, the truck was smaller than it had seemed from above, almost ordinary except for the reinforced construction and the bullet holes in the passenger side door that someone had tried to patch. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cab was empty, which was either good news or meaningless depending on what they found in the cargo area. Miguel brought down bolt cutters and a pry bar, tools that made them feel like criminals even though technically they were just accessing property on private land. The lock resisted for a few minutes before snapping, and the doors swung open with a groan of rusted hinges. The smell that emerged was water and metal and something organic that had long since decomposed. And inside, stacked in careful rows and wrapped in oilcloth that had partially disintegrated, were wooden crates. 23 of them, each about 2 feet square, stenciled with numbers and dates from 1952. Miguel opened the first crate with shaking hands, peeling away rotted fabric to reveal contents that gleamed dully in the spotlight. Gold bars. Stamped with mining company logos and serial numbers, each one weighing maybe 25 pounds, sitting in their molds like they'd been waiting patiently for someone to claim them. The second crate was the same. The third contained bundled currency, mostly destroyed by water damage, but enough intact to see the denominations. Hundreds. Thousands. Money that had been worth killing for. Jacob did rough math in his head, calculating based on gold prices he vaguely remembered from news reports. Even accounting for the need to explain their origin, for the legal complications, for the reduced value of stolen goods, this was millions. Possibly tens of millions. Enough to save the ranch, save his daughter's future, save everything he'd been about to lose. It was also evidence of murder, of crimes his grandfather had probably committed or been complicit in, of a family history that was suddenly much darker than he'd imagined. "You're thinking about keeping it," Miguel said. It wasn't a question. Jacob was thinking exactly that, thinking about how easy it would be to move this somewhere secure, to find a way to convert it gradually, to solve every problem his life contained with gold that had been waiting in the dark for longer than he'd been alive. He was also thinking about 3 dead guards, about families that had never gotten closure, about justice delayed for 40 years. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Claire. She was coming home this weekend. Wanted to talk about selling the ranch. Had a buyer lined up. Thought it was time to be realistic about the situation. Jacob looked at the gold, at Miguel, at the quarry walls that had hidden this secret through wars and recessions and generations. At the choice that had just become his, inevitable and impossible in equal measure. "We need to call the FBI," he said, the words coming out before he could reconsider. "This is a crime scene. This is evidence. This is someone else's justice, even if it's 40 years late." Miguel looked relieved, which told Jacob he'd been hoping for this answer. But as they climbed back up to ground level, as Jacob pulled out his phone to make the call that would change everything, he saw something that stopped him cold. Fresh tire tracks in the clay near the quarry entrance. Tracks from a vehicle that had been here recently, maybe today, that had been watching them work. Someone else knew about this. Someone else had been waiting to see what they'd find. And whoever it was had just seen everything. Jacob stood motionless, staring at those tire tracks like they were a message written in a language he was only beginning to understand. The treads were wide, aggressive, the kind that came on heavy-duty trucks built for rough country. They'd driven in from the service road that connected to the highway, the same road his grandfather had kept gated and locked for as long as Jacob could remember. Someone had cut the chain. Recently. Maybe while they were down in the quarry with the lights blazing, announcing their discovery to anyone watching from the ridgeline. Miguel followed his gaze, his expression darkening. Those weren't there this morning. I checked the gate when we arrived. It was secure. Jacob's mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. Neighbors who'd been curious about the pumping operation. Reporters somehow tipped off about historical excavation. Or something worse. Someone who'd been waiting 40 years for this quarry to give up its secrets, who'd known or suspected what was down there, who had reasons of their own for wanting that gold to stay hidden or to claim it first. He thought about his grandfather's deathbed confession, the fragments of truth Thomas Mercer had offered in morphine Heist 3 years ago. Something about the quarry being insurance. About debts that couldn't be paid any other way. About men who'd helped him and men who'd wanted to hurt him and the impossibly thin line between the two. We make that call now, Miguel said firmly. FBI, state police, whoever handles this. Once it's official, once there's badges and bureaucracy involved, whoever left those tracks can't touch anything without going through proper channels. He was right, and Jacob knew it. But he also knew that the moment those calls were made, control of the narrative passed to people who didn't care about ranch legacies or family reputations. They'd dig into Thomas Mercer's history, into bank records and timelines and associations, and if they found what Jacob suspected they'd find, the ranch would be forfeit. Proceeds of crime, they'd call it. Everything his family had built, seized and auctioned, his daughter's inheritance erased because her great-grandfather had made choices under Depression-era desperation that couldn't be undone or forgiven. The sound of an engine cut through his thoughts. A truck was coming up the service road, moving fast, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Miguel's crew tensed, hands moving unconsciously toward tools that could serve as weapons. Jacob stepped forward, putting himself between his workers and whatever was coming, an instinct so deeply ingrained he didn't question it. The truck that emerged from the tree line was a black Ford F-350, lifted suspension, tinted windows, Montana plates. It stopped 20 yards from where they stood, engine idling, no one getting out immediately. The kind of deliberate intimidation Jacob had seen before at livestock auctions and property disputes, the language of rural threat that didn't need words. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was maybe 35, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing ranch clothes that looked lived in rather than costume. But it was her face that stopped Jacob cold. The bone structure, the set of her jaw, the way she moved with contained energy that suggested violence held barely in check. She looked like someone, like a photograph he'd seen in his grandfather's effects. Like family he hadn't known existed. "My name is Sarah Drummond," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "My grandfather was Frank Drummond. He was one of the men who robbed that bank in Billings. He was also one of the men your grandfather killed and dumped in this quarry." The words hung in the air like gunshots. Miguel swore softly in Spanish. Jacob felt the world tilt slightly, everything he'd suspected suddenly concrete and terrible. His grandfather wasn't just complicit. Thomas Mercer had been a killer, and this woman had come to collect something, justice or revenge or the gold her grandfather had died trying to steal. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacob said, the lie automatic, protective. "This is private property. You need to leave." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been watching this place for 3 months. Waiting for the drought to get bad enough that you'd have to drain the quarry. Knew you would eventually. Desperation makes people predictable." She moved closer, her hands visible and empty, but Jacob didn't doubt she was armed. "My grandmother spent 60 years wondering what happened to Frank. Whether he'd run off. Whether he'd been killed. Whether he'd just abandoned his family for a new life somewhere with stolen gold. She died last year never knowing. But she kept his journals, his letters, his partnerships documented. Including the one with Thomas Mercer." Jacob's phone felt heavy in his pocket. One call to the sheriff's department, and this became someone else's problem. But sheriff's men investigations meant everything coming to light, meant the same destruction Sarah was threatening but through official channels. "What do you want?" he asked instead. "For you to admit what your grandfather did. For you to acknowledge that this ranch, this legacy you're so proud of, was built with blood money. My grandfather was a thief, but yours was worse. He betrayed his partners, killed them, took everything, and pretended to be an honest rancher for the rest of his life." Sarah's voice was rising now, decades of family anger finding expression. "My grandmother raised 4 kids alone during the Depression. Worked herself into an early grave while Thomas Mercer lived comfortable on stolen gold. You owe us. This land owes us." Miguel cleared his throat. "Jacob, we should really call someone. This is beyond what we can handle." But Jacob was thinking about his daughter, about Claire who was coming home tomorrow with papers to sell the ranch. About how this discovery, this confrontation, would play out if authorities got involved. His family's name dragged through mud whether he defended his grandfather or condemned him. The ranch seized or sold at scandal prices. Everything Linda had loved, everything 4 generations had built, reduced to a footnote in someone else's crime story. "How much gold is down there?" Sarah asked, changing tactics. "How much did my grandfather die for?" Jacob considered lying, but what was the point? 23 crates. Mostly bullion. Maybe 20 million current value, maybe more. Enough that people would kill for it now just like they killed for it then. Sarah absorbed this, her expression unreadable. "And you were going to report it?" "Sure you were. You were going to hand over millions that could save your failing ranch, that could secure your daughter's future, because it's the right thing to do." The sarcasm was thick, but underneath it Jacob heard something else. Understanding. She knew exactly what he was facing because she was facing it too. Whatever moral high ground she claimed, she'd also come here for that gold, to claim what she believed was her family share. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm that had been threatening all week was finally moving in, clouds building on the western horizon. In Montana, you learn to read weather like a second language, to know which clouds meant relief and which meant destruction. These were the kind that brought hail and lightning, the kind that killed cattle and burned grassland, that reminded you nature didn't care about your problems. "We should get everyone out of the quarry before that hits," Miguel said. "Those walls aren't stable, and if it floods again with equipment down there, we'll lose everything." Jacob nodded, but he was watching Sarah, trying to understand her play. She'd come here knowing about the gold, probably knowing roughly where it would be, but she'd waited for him to do the hard work of draining and recovering it. That suggested she didn't have the resources or the authority to do it herself. Which meant she needed him in some way, needed his cooperation or at least his silence. "What's your actual endgame here?" he asked bluntly. "You can't take that gold legally. It's evidence of federal crimes. Even if you proved your grandfather's involvement, even if you got a court to acknowledge some kind of claim, the recovery process would take years and cost more in legal fees than it's worth. So what do you really want?" Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I want you to understand what it costs to build something on other people's suffering. I want the Mercer family to acknowledge that everything you have came from my family's loss. And yeah, I want some kind of compensation. Not the gold. That's poison, and we both know it. But this ranch, this land, it's worth something. You could sell off a portion. Pay my family what we're owed for 60 years of wandering and grieving and being labeled as criminals' kin." Jacob felt anger rising, hot and defensive. "My grandfather's choices aren't my responsibility. I didn't know about any of this until 30 minutes ago. You can't hold me accountable for crimes committed before I was born. Can I?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You've benefited from those crimes your whole life. Every meal you ate at that ranch house table, every college class your daughter attended, every time you walked this land feeling proud of your legacy, you were living off what your grandfather stole from mine. Ignorance doesn't erase that. It just makes it easier to sleep at night." The truth of that hit harder than Jacob wanted to admit. He thought about his daughter's education, his wife's medical care, the equipment and improvements that had kept this ranch competitive. How much of it traced back to capital Thomas Mercer shouldn't have had, to a foundation built on murder and theft. Miguel's crew was securing equipment, getting ready to evacuate before the storm hit. Smart men making smart choices while Jacob stood paralyzed by impossible decisions. His phone buzzed again. Claire. She'd landed early. Was already driving from the airport. Would be here in 90 minutes. Wanted to talk seriously about the sale, about moving forward, about letting go of the past. She had no idea what past was about to consume them all. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and dust. Sarah's hair whipped loose from its ponytail. She looked tired suddenly, the anger giving way to something that looked like grief. My grandmother used to tell me stories about Frank. How he'd been funny. How he'd loved his kids fiercely. How the depression had ground him down until he couldn't see options anymore, until robbing a bank seemed like the only way to keep his family fed. She never excused it, never said it was right, but she understood it. She knew what desperation looked like. Jacob understood that too. He'd felt it these past 18 months, watching debts accumulate and options narrow, feeling the weight of legacy pressing down like the sky itself. He hadn't robbed any banks, but he'd thought about moral corners he could cut, about ethical lines that seemed negotiable when survival was at stake. How far was he from becoming his grandfather, really? Just opportunity and maybe a few degrees of desperation. Lightning flickered in the western clouds. Miguel jogged over, breathing hard. We need to make a decision. Storm's moving fast. If we leave that armored car open, if it floods again, evidence gets contaminated. Crime scene investigators will have our heads. But if we try to secure it now, we're tampering. Either way, someone's going to have questions we can't answer well. Jacob looked at Sarah, at Miguel, at his workers packing up equipment. At the quarry that had been his grandfather's failure and his salvation, that held secrets none of them were prepared for. And he realized that every choice available to him was wrong. Calling the FBI meant investigations that would destroy his family's name. Not calling them meant being complicit in covering up murder. Accepting Sarah's claims meant admitting guilt he wasn't sure he bore. Rejecting them meant perpetuating injustice he couldn't deny. There was no clean path forward, no decision that didn't cost something he couldn't afford to lose. I need time, he said finally. 24 hours to talk to my daughter, to figure out what's right. Then we'll bring in authorities together, we'll tell them everything, and we'll let them sort out claims and consequences. Sarah shook her head. 24 hours to hide evidence, you mean? To move some of that gold. To get your story straight. I've waited 3 months. You can wait 24 hours. Jacob's voice was firm now, finding certainty in the midst of chaos. My daughter deserves to hear this from me before it becomes public. She deserves to know what her great-grandfather did, what her family is, before strangers tell her. That's not negotiable. And if you want any chance of claiming what you think you're owed, you need me cooperative, not hostile. We do this right, we do it together, or I call the sheriff right now and we all lose. Sarah considered this, weighing trust against suspicion, pragmatism against anger. The storm was closer now, first drops of rain spattering against dusty ground. Finally, she nodded. 24 hours. But I'm staying close. If I see any vehicles moving equipment, if I see anything that looks like you're trying to move that gold, the deal's off and I go straight to federal authorities with everything I know about Thomas Mercer. Deal, Jacob said, knowing he was buying time he didn't know how to use. Miguel looked between them, clearly unhappy with this arrangement. This is a bad idea, he said quietly. You're making private deals about a federal crime scene. This is how people end up in prison instead of just financial trouble. Maybe, Jacob acknowledged. But it's the only idea I've got. They secured the quarry as best they could, tarping the armored car and setting up barriers that would hopefully prevent contamination during the storm. Sarah watched from her truck, making sure nothing disappeared, making sure the gold stayed where it was. Miguel's crew left, promising to come back in the morning, clearly relieved to escape whatever powder keg this situation had become. And Jacob stood alone in the rain, watching water begin to pool again in the quarry's bottom, thinking about foundations and legacies and the weight of choices made by dead men that lived on in soil and stone and the hearts of those left behind. His phone rang. Claire. She was close, maybe 20 minutes out, excited to talk about fresh starts and new chapters. Jacob answered, his voice steady despite everything. Hey sweetheart. Listen, something's come up. Something about Grandpa Thomas, about the ranch's history. When you get here, we need to talk. Really talk. About what this place is and what it cost and whether it's something we can keep or should let go. There was silence on the other end, confused silence, and then Claire's voice, cautious now. Dad, what happened? What did you find? He looked at the quarry, at Sarah's truck, at the storm sweeping across land that had seen so much and kept so many secrets. The truth, he said simply. I found the truth. And I don't know what to do with it. The line crackled with static and distance, and then Claire said something that made Jacob's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what family does, right? We face hard things together. He thought about his grandfather, about Frank Drummond, about men who'd made choices in isolation and left their families to deal with consequences. About how different things might have been if Thomas Mercer had trusted someone with the truth instead of burying it with gold in a flooded quarry. Yeah, Jacob said quietly. That's what family does. The storm hit in full force then, rain turning to hail, pounding the truck's roof like judgment. Jacob sat in the cab, watching water stream down the windshield, watching the quarry begin to fill again, and he thought about his wife who'd loved this land despite knowing how hard it was. About his daughter who'd wanted to escape it but was coming back anyway. About the weight of legacy and the cost of survival and the impossibly complicated truth that sometimes the people we love most are also capable of terrible things. And sometimes we have to decide whether understanding that makes us complicit or just makes us human. Sarah's truck was still there, headlights cutting through the storm, a silent witness to whatever happened next. Tomorrow Claire would arrive. Tomorrow they'd have to decide together what truth looked like, what justice meant when it was 40 years delayed, what they owed to the past and what they owed to the future. Tonight, Jacob just sat in the storm and let himself feel the full weight of what his grandfather had done. The lives taken. The families destroyed. The fortune hidden. The ranch built on blood money and silence. It was his inheritance now, all of it, the good and the terrible, and there was no way to separate one from the other. The land didn't make those distinctions. It just remembered everything and kept growing grass over the graves. Claire arrived just after dawn, her rental car kicking up dust on the gravel drive that needed regrading. Jacob watched from the porch, coffee cup cold in his hands, trying to remember the last time he'd slept. The storm had passed around 3 a.m, leaving everything scrubbed clean and smelling of wet sage. Sarah's truck was still parked near the quarry entrance, a black silhouette against the pale morning sky. She hadn't moved all night, keeping watch like a sentry over treasure that belonged to ghosts. His daughter looked tired as she climbed out, her business casual clothes seeming out of place against the ranch backdrop. She'd been gone 6 months, but it felt longer. The distance between them wasn't just geographic anymore. It was philosophical, generational, the kind of gap that opened when one person saw land as legacy and another saw it as liability. But when she spotted him on the porch, her expression shifted from professional determination to something softer. She'd always been able to read him, even when he tried to hide things. "Dad," she said, climbing the steps, "what's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in days." He gestured for her to sit, then realized there was no easy way into this conversation. No preamble that would soften what he needed to tell her. So he started with the drought, with the decision to drain the quarry, with the shape that emerged from 40 years of dark water. He told her about the armored car, about the gold, about the bank robbery in Billings that had left 3 men dead and families destroyed. He watched her face cycle through disbelief and horror and something that looked like grief for an innocence she was losing in real time. And then he told her about Sarah Drummond, about Frank Drummond who'd been Thomas Mercer's partner and victim, about the debt their family carried whether they'd known it or not. Claire was silent for a long time after he finished, staring out at fields that looked different now that she knew what fertilized them. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Grandpa Thomas killed people. He murdered his partners and built this whole place on blood money. Everything we are, everything I thought we were, it's all built on that. Jacob wanted to defend his grandfather, to contextualize Depression-era desperation, to explain how good men sometimes made terrible choices. But the words felt hollow before he could speak them. Yeah, he said simply. That's what it looks like. And now we have to decide what to do with that truth. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning moisture, turning the landscape golden. Sarah's truck door opened. She stepped out, stretching stiff muscles, her attention fixed on the ranch house. Jacob could feel Claire tense beside him. That's her, Claire said. The granddaughter. She's been here all night? Keeping watch. Making sure we don't do what our grandfather did. Making sure we don't hide the truth for our own benefit. Claire absorbed this, her engineer's mind working through problems and solutions. What does she want? Beyond acknowledgement, beyond making us face what happened. Money probably. Compensation for what her family lost. Jacob paused. And maybe she's right to want it. Maybe we do owe her something. We've benefited from crimes we didn't commit but that made our lives possible. That's not nothing. His daughter looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When I was little, she said slowly, you used to tell me stories about Grandpa Thomas. About how he survived the Depression through hard work and smart choices. About how he built something from nothing that would last for generations. I believed those stories. They made me proud of where I came from. Her voice cracked slightly. Now I don't know what to believe. Jacob reached for her hand, finding it cold despite the warming day. We believe that people are complicated. That good and bad can exist in the same person, the same family, the same piece of land. Your great-grandfather did terrible things, but he also raised your grandfather to be decent. He built something that fed families and supported this community. The foundation is rotten, but what grew from it isn't all poison. Claire wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying. That's convenient logic. That's how people justify benefiting from injustice. We can't just decide the bad parts don't count because we like the results. She was right, and Jacob knew it. But he also knew that moral absolutes rarely survived contact with actual human complexity, with the messy reality of trying to live with inherited guilt. We're not deciding anything yet, he said. We're going to talk to Sarah. We're going to figure out what justice looks like 40 years late. And then we're going to call the authorities together and let the legal system handle what we can't. But first, I needed you to hear it from me. To know what this place is before you decided whether to sell it or keep it or burn it to the ground. Claire laughed, but it was bitter. Those are the options now? That's what we're reduced to. Jacob shrugged. Legacy is always about choosing what to carry forward and what to leave behind. We just have to make that choice with more information than most people get. The ugly truth instead of comfortable myths. They walked down to the quarry together, father and daughter, their boots finding the same rhythm on the worn path. Sarah was waiting at the edge, arms crossed, her expression guarded but not hostile. She nodded to Claire. You look like your grandmother. Linda. I saw pictures while I was researching your family. She seemed like a good person. Claire's response was automatic. She was. The best person I knew. Sarah's expression softened fractionally. My grandmother was too. Raised 4 kids alone after Frank disappeared. Worked as a seamstress, took in laundry, did whatever it took. Never remarried. Never really recovered from not knowing what happened to him. She died thinking he'd abandoned her, that the family hadn't been enough to make him stay. That's its own kind of hell. The two women looked at each other, separated by history and united by loss, and Jacob could see something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. They were both inheritors of choices made by desperate men, both trying to figure out how to live with legacies they hadn't chosen. "What happens now?" Claire asked, her voice steadier. "Do we split the gold? Try to monetize evidence of murder? That seems impossible and wrong in equal measure." Sarah shook her head. "The gold goes to the FBI. We all know that's the only legal option. But this ranch, this land, it has value beyond what's in that quarry. And the Mercer family owes the Drummond family something. Not everything. Not enough to destroy you. But enough to acknowledge that our suffering made your comfort possible." She pulled out papers from her truck, photocopies of journals and letters, documentation of the partnership between Thomas Mercer and Frank Drummond. Proof that they'd planned the robbery together, that they'd agreed to split the proceeds, that Frank had trusted Thomas with his life and his family's future. "And this," she said, holding up a final document. "Thomas Mercer's will from 1965. He left provisions for an unnamed beneficiary, paid through a lawyer in Billings. Quarterly payments that continued until 1982. My grandmother received them. She thought they were from some kind of insurance policy Frank had set up before he died. She never knew they were guilt money." Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandfather had tried to make amends, in his own broken way. Had sent money to the family he'd destroyed, anonymous payments that couldn't resurrect the dead but could ease the suffering of the living. It didn't excuse the murder. It didn't balance the scales. But it suggested Thomas Mercer had understood what he'd done, had carried the weight of it, had tried to repair damage that couldn't truly be repaired. "That changes things," Claire said quietly. "Not completely. Not enough. But it changes them. It means he knew. It means he felt guilty. It means he tried, even if what he tried was inadequate." Sarah nodded. "It does change things. Which is why I'm not asking for millions. I'm not trying to destroy your family the way mine was destroyed. I just want acknowledgement. Public acknowledgement in whatever statement you give to investigators. And I want the ranch to establish a scholarship fund in Frank Drummond's name. For kids from struggling families in Montana. Kids whose parents made mistakes or faced impossible choices. Kids who deserve better than what desperation offers." The request was so reasonable, so measured compared to what she could have demanded, that Jacob felt relief wash through him like rain on drought-cracked soil. "We can do that," he said. "We should do that. It's right." Claire was nodding too, her engineer's mind finding solutions in frameworks of repair and restitution. "We could fund it with proceeds from selling off the eastern pasture. The section that borders National Forest. It's valuable to conservationists, and it would generate enough to endow the scholarship permanently." Sarah looked between them, suspicion warring with hope. "You'd sell off part of your legacy for this? You'd diminish the ranch to make amends for something your grandfather did?" Claire answered before Jacob could. "Legacy isn't about holding on to every acre. It's about being able to live with ourselves. About building something honest on a foundation we can't change but can acknowledge. If that means the ranch is smaller, if that means we have less, then that's the price of being decent people. We should have been paying it all along." The quarry water was starting to drain again, Miguel's pumps working through the storm accumulation. By afternoon, the armored car would be exposed again, its cargo visible, its history undeniable. Jacob pulled out his phone. Time to make the calls. FBI first, then state police, then probably lawyers for all of them. This was going to get complicated, was going to involve investigations and interviews and media attention they couldn't control. But it would be the truth, finally spoken into daylight after 40 years in darkness. He looked at his daughter and Sarah, at two women who could have been enemies but were choosing something harder and better, and he felt something like pride despite everything. This was how you honored the dead, not by hiding their crimes but by refusing to perpetuate them. Not by protecting comfortable lies but by speaking uncomfortable truths and accepting their consequences. The FBI arrived by evening, a field team from Billings that treated the quarry like the crime scene it was. They documented everything, photographed everything, cataloged the gold with careful precision. The lead agent, a woman named Torres, listened to their story without interrupting, her face carefully neutral. When they finished, when they'd explained everything including Sarah's family connection and their agreement about acknowledgement and restitution, Torres sat back and studied them. You understand this complicates things legally. The ranch's title, its assets, they're potentially subject to seizure as proceeds of crime. Even if Thomas Mercer is dead, even if you didn't know, the government can make claims. Jacob had expected this. We understand. We're prepared to cooperate fully. To provide complete financial records. To accept whatever consequences are appropriate. We're not asking for special treatment. We're just asking to be allowed to make amends while we still can. Torres made notes, her expression softening slightly. The honest approach usually works better than trying to hide things. And the fact that you called us yourselves, that you're volunteering information and offering restitution, that counts for something. It won't erase the crimes, but it demonstrates good faith. She looked at Sarah. And you're not pursuing any personal claims to the recovered gold? Sarah shook her head. I want my grandfather's name cleared. I want people to know he wasn't just a thief who abandoned his family. He was a man who made a terrible choice and paid for it with his life. That's the only justice I'm after. The gold can go back to the mining company's insurers or the government or wherever it legally belongs. I don't want blood money any more than they do. Torres nodded approvingly. That makes this significantly simpler. I'll need full statements from all of you, and there will be more questions, but preliminary assessment suggests you're more witnesses than suspects. The crimes in question are 40 years old. The perpetrator is deceased. Our focus will be on recovering assets and providing closure to the victims' families. But it felt different now. Lighter somehow, despite everything they'd lost. As if the land itself had been holding its breath, waiting for truth to surface, and could finally exhale. Claire joined him at the ridge where 6 generations of Mercers were buried. They'd added a marker for Frank Drummond, a small acknowledgement that he was part of this place's history too, that his bones might be mixed with this soil somewhere, that memory should include the victims along with the victors. Think Mom would approve, Claire asked, her voice soft. Of how we handled this? Of choosing honesty over preservation? Jacob thought about Linda, about her fundamental decency, about how she'd always pushed him to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong thing. She'd know. She'd understand that some legacies are worth diminishing if it means being able to look yourself in the mirror. His daughter slipped her hand into his, the gesture casual but weighted with everything they'd been through. I'm staying, she said. Not forever maybe, but for now. We've got work to do here, and it feels important. Feels like the first honest thing this ranch has done in generations. Jacob squeezed her hand, grateful beyond words. Together then. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain from storms building over the mountains. The land remembered everything, and now, finally, its secrets had been spoken into daylight. The cost had been high, would continue being high, but some prices were worth paying. Some truths were worth the telling, even when they burned away comfortable illusions. The Mercer ranch would endure, smaller but honest, built now on acknowledgement rather than silence. And somewhere in the fading light, Jacob could almost hear his grandfather's voice, rough with age and regret, saying the words he'd never managed in life. Thank you. Thank you for finishing what I couldn't. Thank you for being strong enough to face what I wasn't. Thank you for choosing truth. The land stretched out before them, forever and finite, demanding and forgiving, holding their history in soil that would outlast them all. And for the first time in 18 months, Jacob felt something like peace. Not because the problems were solved, not because the future was certain, but because the foundation they stood on was finally honest. And honest ground, however hard one, was the only kind worth building on. Winter came early that year, the first snow arriving in late October and settling over the ranch like forgiveness. Jacob stood at the kitchen window, watching flakes drift past the barn where Claire was finishing evening chores. She'd been home for 8 months now, long enough that her Denver apartment had been sublet, long enough that she'd started dating the veterinarian from town, long enough that the word temporary had stopped appearing in conversations about her future. The scholarship fund had awarded its second round of grants in September, 25 students this time, the endowment growing as word spread about what it represented. Not charity exactly, but restitution. The transformation of old guilt into new possibility. Sarah Drummond had become something unexpected. Not quite family, but not a stranger either. She visited twice that fall, once to speak at a community college about her grandmother's resilience, once to help Claire organize the scholarship selection committee. They'd developed an easy rapport, these two women connected by crimes neither had committed, bonded by the choice to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. During her last visit, Sarah had brought photographs. Images of Frank Drummond as a young father, holding babies who would grow up without him. Pictures of her grandmother at various ages, the light fading from her eyes as years passed without answers. And one photo of Thomas Mercer and Frank Drummond together, probably from 1951, both men lean and serious, partners in something that would destroy them both. Jacob had that photograph framed now, hanging in the ranch office beside images of his own family. Not to celebrate what they'd done, but to remember that history was complicated, that good and evil rarely existed in pure forms, that understanding required holding multiple truths simultaneously. The legal settlements had been finalized in November. The ranch lost 40% of its acreage but kept its heart, the original homestead and the pastures closest to the house. The reduction forced efficiency, made them think carefully about sustainable practices and modern management. Claire had implemented rotational grazing that improved soil health while reducing costs. They'd diversified into heritage breed cattle that commanded premium prices from restaurants seeking authentic Montana beef. The operation was leaner but healthier, profitable in ways the sprawling original ranch had rarely managed. Jacob's accountant had called it a miracle. Jacob called it what happened when you stopped trying to maintain something built on rotten foundations and started building honestly from ground that had been cleared and prepared properly. The community's response had evolved over the months. Initial scandal had given way to something more nuanced as people understood the full story. Thomas Mercer had committed murder, yes, but he'd also employed half the county during hard times, had served on the school board for 20 years, had been a volunteer firefighter and a 4-H sponsor. Frank Drummond had participated in robbery and murder, but he'd also been a devoted father and a decent man ground down by Depression-era desperation. The guards who died had families who deserved justice, and they'd finally received it, decades late but still meaningful. There were no simple heroes or villains, just people making choices under impossible pressure, leaving consequences that rippled through generations. The local historical society had created an exhibit about the case, focusing on economic conditions that drove crime, on the costs of silence, on the importance of confronting difficult truths. School groups toured it, learning that history wasn't just dates and battles but human choices with lasting impacts. Miguel had taken a job as the ranch's operations manager, a role that let him apply decades of experience to rebuilding what the revelations had dismantled. He and Jacob worked well together, two men who understood that land required constant attention, constant care, constant willingness to adapt to changing conditions. They were repairing fence line one December afternoon when Miguel mentioned that his daughter Rebecca was applying for the Drummond Scholarship. "She wants to study environmental engineering," he said, his voice carrying pride and hope in equal measure. "Wants to come back here after college and help ranches implement sustainable water systems." This drought, what it revealed, it made her think about how we manage resources. How we plan for futures we might not see. Jacob felt something warm settle in his chest. That's exactly what the fund is for. What Frank Drummond should have had access to. What might have changed his choices if education had been an option instead of desperation. They worked in comfortable silence after that, repairing wire and posts, doing the unglamorous work that kept operations functional, that nobody noticed until it failed. Christmas that year felt different. Claire cooked dinner in Linda's kitchen, using Linda's recipes, and Jacob found himself telling stories about his wife that he hadn't been able to speak aloud since she died. How she'd loved this land despite understanding its demands. How she'd seen beauty in calving season and haying time, in the rhythm of ranch work that never really stopped. How she'd taught Claire to see the ranch as something living, something that required relationship rather than just ownership. "You would have handled all this better than I did," Jacob said quietly, looking at Linda's photograph on the mantel. "You would have known immediately what the right thing was, would have done it without all my hesitation and fear." Claire touched his shoulder gently. "Mom would have been proud of what you did. What we did. Choosing hard truth over comfortable lies, that's what she taught us. That's her legacy as much as Grandpa Thomas's crimes are his." Jacob nodded, understanding that legacy was always multiple things simultaneously, that families carried both shame and honor forward, that the measure of character was which parts you chose to perpetuate and which you worked to redeem. By spring, the ranch had found its rhythm. Smaller operations meant closer attention, better quality, stronger relationships with buyers who valued sustainable practices. Claire had connected with a coalition of Montana ranchers implementing regenerative agriculture, sharing techniques and resources, building networks that made small operations viable in ways isolation never could. The land itself seemed to respond, grass growing thicker, wildlife returning to areas that had been overgrazed, streams running clearer through pastures managed with care rather than extraction. Sarah visited in April for the scholarship ceremony, bringing her teenage daughter this time, a girl who looked remarkably like the photographs of Frank Drummond's children. "This is where your great-grandfather died," Sarah told her daughter at the Quarry overlook, her voice steady. "He made terrible choices, but he wasn't a terrible person. He was desperate and afraid and he trusted the wrong man. We remember that. We don't excuse it, but we remember it." Her daughter absorbed this silently, and Jacob saw in her face the same struggle he'd watched Claire experience. The wrestling with complicated inheritance, with the impossibility of simple moral judgments, with the weight of carrying forward both shame and strength from the same source. The scholarship ceremony had grown. 50 students now, funded by the endowment and by anonymous donations from people who'd been moved by the story. Representatives from the guards' families attended, their presence a reminder that justice included multiple perspectives, multiple losses, multiple needs for closure. One of them, a woman in her 60s whose grandfather had died in the robbery, approached Jacob afterward. "Thank you," she said simply. "For not hiding this. For making sure people remembered that men died, that families suffered, that crimes had real victims. My grandfather was just doing his job, protecting other people's money, and he never came home. Knowing what happened, finally knowing after all these years, that matters. It doesn't fix anything, but it matters." Jacob had no adequate response except to acknowledge her pain, to promise that the scholarship students would learn the full story, would understand that their opportunities were built on acknowledging multiple tragedies, multiple families scarred by the same events. Summer brought the kind of work that kept Jacob's hands busy and his mind clear. Haying season, calving season, the endless cycle of maintenance and preparation that defined ranch life. Claire worked beside him, stronger now than when she'd first returned, her engineer's mind finding solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable. She'd started talking about the future with certainty rather than hesitation, about building a house on the southern ridge, about raising children who would know this land's full history, who would inherit honest legacy rather than comfortable myths. Jacob watched her transformation with gratitude and grief intertwined. His daughter was becoming the kind of person Linda had been, the kind who saw clearly and acted accordingly, who understood that love for place required telling its truth. One evening in July, they sat on the porch watching thunderheads build over the mountains, the air heavy with approaching rain. "Think Grandpa Thomas would approve," Claire asked, "of what we've done with his legacy?" Jacob considered this carefully. "I think he'd be relieved. I think he spent 60 years carrying guilt he couldn't speak, trying to make amends in ways that never felt adequate. What we did, choosing transparency over preservation, that's what he couldn't do. Maybe it's what he wished he'd done. Maybe that's its own kind of inheritance, finishing what previous generations couldn't." The rain came, gentle and steady, soaking into soil that had been too dry for too long. They sat in the sound of it, water feeding grass and crops, replenishing aquifers, sustaining life in ways that required no human intervention beyond grateful witness. The land would endure. It always did. Families came and went, fortunes rose and fell, secrets were buried and excavated, but the land remained. Changed by use and abuse, shaped by choices and consequences, but fundamentally itself. Patient. Remembering. Waiting for people to learn what it had to teach about cycles and seasons, about death feeding life, about how nothing was ever truly lost because everything returned to soil eventually and rose again in new forms. In August, Jacob received a letter from the FBI. The investigation was officially closed. All recovered assets had been distributed. The case file would be maintained for historical purposes, but no further action was required. They were, in the bureaucratic language of federal agencies, clear. Free. Released from formal scrutiny if not from the weight of what they'd learned and chosen. He showed the letter to Claire, who read it twice before setting it aside. "So that's it," she said. "We're done. We've faced the truth, made amends as best we can, and now we just live with it." Just? Jacob smiled slightly. Living with it is the hardest part. Choosing every day to build honestly, to remember clearly, to resist the temptation of comfortable forgetting. That's the work of a lifetime. She nodded, understanding. "Then I guess we'd better get started." They did. Through autumn and into winter again, through another year of seasons and work and slow transformation. The ranch became known for quality rather than size, for practices that sustained rather than extracted, for a family that had chosen difficult honesty over convenient silence. Students who'd received Drummond scholarships sometimes visited, curious about the place that funded their education, learning that opportunity often grew from the strangest soil, that redemption was possible even when forgiveness wasn't, that legacy could be transformed by people willing to face their inheritance completely. On a cold morning in December, 2 years after draining the quarry, Jacob stood at Thomas Mercer's grave on the eastern ridge. He'd come to say something, though he wasn't entirely sure what. The words came slowly, pulled from places he hadn't known he carried them. "You did terrible things. You killed men who trusted you. You built our family's fortune on blood and betrayal. I can't forgive that. I'm not sure anyone can. But I understand now that you were human. Desperate and afraid and convinced you had no other options. I understand that you tried to make amends in the only ways you knew how, inadequate as they were. And I understand that carrying your secrets probably destroyed you slowly, that guilt was its own punishment." He paused, cold wind cutting across the ridge. "We've told your truth now. All of it. The good and the terrible. We've made different choices, better choices, because we could. Because you'd already paid the prices that bought us that freedom. I don't know if that's redemption. I don't know if land and money built on crime can ever be fully cleansed. But we're trying. We'll keep trying. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any generation can do. Try to be wiser than the one before. Try to break the cycles. Try to leave something honest for whoever comes next." The wind carried his words away across fields that stretched to the mountains, across land that had seen so much and remembered everything and judged nothing because judgment wasn't its nature. The land just was. Patient and enduring and forever teaching the same lessons about mortality and continuity, about how all human drama was temporary but the consequences of choices lived on in soil and stone and the hearts of those who inherited them. Jacob walked back to the house where Claire was making breakfast, where warmth and coffee and conversation waited. Where life continued, complicated and imperfect and honest. The ranch would endure. Smaller now, built on clearer foundations, maintained by people who understood what it cost and what it meant and what responsibility came with calling something yours. The Mercer name would be remembered, for crimes and for the courage to acknowledge them, for building and for tearing down and for rebuilding differently. And somewhere in all of that, justice would be approximated if never fully achieved, because true justice for 40-year-old crimes was impossible but the attempt still mattered. The trying still counted. The choice to face truth still changed everything. Spring would come again. The cycle would continue. Students would be educated. Cattle would be raised. Grass would grow on the ridge where 5 generations rested and where someday Jacob would rest too, his own story complete, his own choices judged by whoever came after. He hoped they'd understand. Hoped they'd see that he'd tried, that choosing the harder path had been worth it, that honest legacy was the only kind worth preserving. But if they didn't, if they judged him harshly or kindly or forgot him entirely, that was all right too. The land would remember. The land always did. And that was enough. That had to be enough. That was all any of them would ever have. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.